Hi, welcome. I believe there'll still be some more people coming, but I think it's time that we begin. For all the people in the back, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. At this point, I'd like to introduce to you Laurie Scott, who is head of the middle school, who will welcome us all. Thank you.
Welcome, good evening. Rowena has a professional obligation out of town. She sends her regrets as well as her greetings, and I'm honored to step in here in her absence. I'd like to begin by thanking the Heschel Holocaust Commemoration Committee and its chair, Harry Uvegi, for organizing tonight's program. This committee enables members of the Heschel community to come together, share and preserve our stories from the Shoah, and maintain artifacts from families in our school. The stories come from individual families, but this committee allows all of these stories to be shared with the entire Heschel community. Stories of terrible tragedy, extraordinary courage, and stories that together represent a part of who we are as a school, what shapes us, and what we value as a community. As the head of the middle school, I am especially honored to be here tonight. Our 8th grade students study the Shoah as part of their social studies curriculum and leading up to their spring Israel trip. This program includes a trip to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in D.C., as well as a visit to Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. And we focus not just on the horrors of the Holocaust, but also on heroes, resistance, the rich Jewish life in Eastern Europe before the Holocaust, as well as the aftermath. When I read through Mr. Phillips' biography, I noticed that he was of the bar mitzvah age at a time when Germany was becoming virulently anti-Semitic. In our middle school, every week we celebrate a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah. And these occasions are wonderful and joyous and celebratory. When I read through a biography of somebody who was of bar mitzvah age around the time of the Shoah, I realize how lucky we are that we do not live at a time of rampant anti-Semitism, that there are other times in our history when a bar mitzvah celebration was more risky and more perilous. And we, in contrast, can celebrate free of danger and free of persecution. I would like to thank Mr. Phillips in advance for joining us tonight to share his story with the Heschel School community. I would also like to thank the members of the Holocaust Commemoration Committee, with a special thanks to the subcommittee chairs, Eva Stark-Zadarsky, head of the event committee, and Eva played a very large role in organizing tonight's program, so thank you, Eva. Trudy Gottesman, head of the archive committee, David Fogel, head of the website committee, these are all subcommittees, and Eva Fogelman, head of the education liaison subcommittee. I'd also like to thank Richard and the facilities staff, as well as our security staff, for helping open our building and run a video camera tonight. Again, special thanks to our committee chair, Harry Uvegi, whom I'd like to welcome back to the microphone now.
Thank you. I'll let Rowena know how wonderful this was. Aside from the welcome, there was something that happened to me 2 weeks ago that I wanted to share with our intimate group of members as well as the group that's here this evening. And I was invited 2 weeks ago by a psychologist who in her PhD program was given the challenge of a topic of interviewing an individual who is influenced in growing up by survivors of the Holocaust and the traumas associated with that. And when I was asked to participate in that, I had no qualms about saying, yes, I'd like to participate in that. The question started, and I began responding, and an hour and a half later, my experience was beyond my comprehension, that I had begun to dig deeper than I thought I was able to. and was astounded by how much I had been harboring as a child of survivors. And then I began to think about the quest that we have and the mission that we have to record community members who have survived, parents in this community, grandparents in the community, and even among our own committee members, the struggle that we have in terms of being able to even fill out a simple form that brings forward some of the details, as simple as where we came from and the town we came from. And that is kind of an after effect of what I know I've experienced, and when my parents didn't talk, and took decades for them to talk about what they went through. What I came away with 2 days later was the experience that I now perceive my parents of having the experience of going through what was the darkest moment in their life, total negative dark forces that were chasing them wherever they faced. But through all of this, they had within them the courage and the awareness that they can get through this. And having struggled for those many years in getting through this, and then managing to come to this country to start a new life, I realized that that survival mechanism is part of my inheritance. And it's with that perspective that I stand here as part of this group, the Heschel Holocaust Commemoration Committee, to commit to bringing forward these lessons of survival, but also lessons of life before and after, and present them in a way that we know best, and we're continuing to evolve. So much so that we've gathered 50 stories that are part of our archives. And for all the years that we've been doing this, we've been doing it in an analog way. We've been taking them down on pieces of paper and putting them into binders. Well, this past spring, we hit a milestone. And that milestone is that the new Heschel website that is now available for everybody to view has within it the Heschel Holocaust Remembrance Archive, a page now, but many pages to come over the next few months, few years, that we are now digitizing all of that data so that we could bring it to the lower school, the middle school, and the high school students, for them to become more aware of our own community and the community at large in a way that they may not have known, and in a way that they can now begin to know their legacy. And I just would love to thankfully recognize everybody in our committee. And just do me one more favor. If everybody in the room that's on the committee, just please stand so that we could all see each other and acknowledge each other. This new endeavor in terms of digitizing this amazing collective would not be possible without one of the committee members, David Fogel, and we thank you wholeheartedly. On that note, Georgette, thank you.
Harry, you always manage to be so moving, and I think what you've done here just makes such an enormous contribution, so thank you. I'm a Heschel mom. Joshua Mark Tannenbaum is my son, and we've been involved with Heschel since he was in kindergarten. And unfortunately, the high school is on an all-school Shabbaton, so he didn't get to be here tonight to hear the person who he calls Happy. But then again, he's heard the story lots of times, but he loves hearing the stories. Pappy, to Joshua, is really Gary Phillips, née Gerd Philipsson of Berlin. And he is my relative, he's my closest relative, but not because the blood tie is close. He's actually my third cousin-in-law. But he is my closest relative and the last remaining link to my childhood. So he is a very, very precious member of our family. I call him Pips, and Pips and his wife, and of course he always reminds me I mispronounce it, it should really be Peeps, but at my age, it's much too late to change how I pronounce Pips. I was born in Budapest right after the war. My parents were both Holocaust survivors. They both went through the whole gamut. We all know the stories, but I'm not here to tell their story. We escaped Hungary in 1948, right after the Iron Curtain dropped. We escaped to France, which is where I spent my early childhood. And we stayed there for 5 years, waiting for the visa that would allow us to come to the United States. When that visa finally arrived, and the ship on which we came over, the Ile-de-France, pulled over to the pier, the people who were waiting there for us on the dock were Pips and his wife, Olga. Olga was my mother's second cousin, so that's how Pips gets to be my third cousin-in-law. We arrived at a time that Olga and Pips were still living in fairly humble circumstances, and so I got to watch this voyage of these two Holocaust survivors, Olga and Pips, from Pips's days as a messenger living on Metropolitan Avenue in Kew Gardens, moving up to a photo agency, which he eventually came to own, Globe Photo, which was the largest photo agency in the world. And I was so taken with the business that he was in and the work that he did, because he was always dealing with movie stars and selling picture stories to magazines. And I was absolutely enchanted, and I said, Pips, what can I do to get my picture in a magazine? I was about 8 years old then, and he said, well, you have to grow a second head, and then you'll get your picture in the magazine. Eventually, I was able to achieve that without growing a second head. Pips was the person who taught me how to play tennis very badly. Pips was the person who, when I was a child, would pick me up by one arm and one leg and swing me around. And I absolutely adored him. And he was a very important figure in my life because my father died only a year after we finally arrived in the United States. I adored him, and I resented Olga because she had him and I wanted him. And I would have dreams about scotch taping Olga to a wall. These were actual dreams that I had. Well, Olga was a very precious part of my life as well. And I think it's important to say a couple of words about Olga. You're hearing me refer to her in the past tense. And that's because, tragically, Olga committed suicide 3 years ago. And the reason I mention Olga's suicide is because Olga was an Auschwitz survivor. And The older she became, the more overwhelmed she became with memories of the Holocaust, with survivor's guilt, and she just sank deeper and deeper into a depression until she just lost all interest in life. I think it's important to recognize that the victims of the Holocaust didn't all die in the Holocaust. There are victims of the Holocaust who died decades later, but because of the Holocaust. Phillips is an extraordinary human being. He survived the Holocaust. He survived Olga's death. They had been married just about 60 years, 60, at the time that she died. And he has survived all these things because of his extraordinary spirit, which I think you'll see when he speaks. Phillips is somebody who sees the absurdity in life all the time. He is a character straight from central casting. He has a non-stop sense of humor, which is more often than not a source of tremendous embarrassment to me. But nevertheless, I applaud his spirit. He's an extraordinary human being. And I think you're going to enjoy his story. One doesn't usually use the word enjoy in relation to Holocaust stories, but you're going to enjoy his, because as with everything else, he sees the absurdities and he sees the humor, and that's one of the things that got him through. So it is with love and enormous pleasure that I introduce you to my third cousin-in-law, Gary Peeps Phillips.
Thank you, Donna. You did me almost. I wish I could blush. So many good things have about me have done for years. Anyway, my name is Gary Phillips. I was born and raised in Berlin. And a year ago, I went to Berlin as a guest of the Berlin government and stayed in a very fine hotel, the Kempinski Hotel, in the Fasanenstraße in West Berlin, western part of Berlin, half a block away from the Kurfürstendamm, which was still is the sort of Madison Avenue and Park Avenue combined in Berlin. And I looked across the street and saw a little Jewish community center right across the street. Didn't need a big one because there are not that many Jews in Berlin anymore. I remembered suddenly that I stood in the very same spot on November the 9th, 1938, and watched one of the biggest and finest synagogue in Berlin burn to the ground. At that time, I was a bicycle messenger. The little private Jewish school to which I went had been closed in about a year earlier. And I saw a crowd of people in that street. I wondered what was up. So I went there and I saw the synagogue burn. I also saw suddenly a man jumping away from the crowd, running away from the crowd, and people running after him. A Jew, a Jew! And half a block or a block away is the subway tracks. They raised the grating that lets air into the tracks, threw them down, and later, I didn't see it myself, but I heard later that a train came and finished him. So that was the essence of my experience of so-called Kristallnacht. And as you probably know, It wasn't just burning the synagogues. They burned all the synagogues in Berlin except two. It was, of course, the destruction of all Jewish stores, which had been marked prior to that. And it was the arrest of 30,000 male Jews put into concentration camps, and they were told that if you get a visa, we let you go. That was 38. That was still the good old days. Also, a fine to the Jewish community was issued of 1 billion marks. And at the exchange rate 4-to-1, that was about $250 million. The Jews didn't have that much money, so they helped themselves to whatever Jewish property there was to be had. So that, in a sense, was the Kristallnacht. And I think I realized it then, and I certainly know it now, that this marked the beginning of Jewish life in Germany. When I say Germany, I also include Austria, because Austria had already been liberated by Adolf. There are a couple of other things I want to mention. Fire. And I have some notes. Fire. The Nazis loved fire. And maybe it dates back to their time when they were, what were they? I made a note of it. But anyway, when they were even less civilized. On January the 30th, 1933, Hitler came to power. He was appointed Chancellor. And there was a torchlight parade of about 100,000 SA men, brown shirts, walking unter den Linden, marching by, and Hitler stood on a hotel and waited for him. A month later, the Germans set fire to the Reichstag, the parliament building in Berlin. They blamed it on the communists, one particular communist, a Dutchman named I forgot, who was a half-wit. It was ridiculous. This guy couldn't have burned down a barn, let alone this enormous Reichstag. So they burned down the Reichstag. They had no use for it anyway. And a month later, in February of 33, they burned books. They burned in Berlin alone, they burned about 20,000 books. And so they did in other cities throughout Germany. Last year I was at the very spot where these books were burned, across the street from the University of Berlin. And of course, not only in Berlin, but throughout Germany, the synagogues were torched and burned. And I don't know whether you know about it, they had a reason for it. A Polish Jewish boy, I think he was 17 or 19 years old, had shot and killed Ernst vom Rath, who was a secretary in the German embassy in Paris. His parents had been living in Germany for, God knows, 20, 30, 40 years. But all Polish Jews were deprived of citizenship and rights, and shipped to the Polish border, and the Poles didn't want to let them in, so they were in the miserable state. And for revenge or whatever, he killed this guy who had nothing to do with this program. And that was the thing that triggered the action. And I assumed that this was already preordained, that was already planned, because they couldn't have carried it off within a day. They did because within a day of the death of this Ernst von Rath. I'm going to add some notes here. Herschel Greenspan was his name. And the whole thing was organized and supervised by Joseph Goebbels, who was the Minister of Propaganda, very effective, whose wife, by the way, had been raised partly by a Jewish family by the name of Lachmann, book publishers. Lachmann Mosse was a book publishing company, And at one time, for several years, they had at least partially raised the woman who became the wife of Joseph Goebbels. And Goebbels was Hitler's most faithful followers. And when Hitler was in the bunker and the Soviet army was at the gates, the Goebbels family were the only ones who decided that life without Hitler was not worth living for themselves and their 6 children. So when Hitler committed suicide, they committed suicide and killed all the children. All the other big shot Nazis tried to get the hell out of the bunker. Now I want to say something briefly about what is called the Endlösung, the final solution of the Jewish problem. And I think very few people really realize what led up to it. Originally, the Nazis tried to get the Jews out of Germany. They wanted to make Germany Judenrein, free of Jews. And they encouraged Jewish immigration. Get rid of them. And one of the people who got involved with that a little later, was a man named Adolf Eichmann. So they managed to get rid of about 50% of the Jews in Germany. And we're talking about, I think, well, in Berlin there were more than 100,000 Jews before 33, before it started. And I don't know, in Germany it might have been 500,000 more. So they got rid of about half of them. Then Germany started World War II on September 1st, 1939, by attacking Poland. And as you know, within a year, they managed to conquer not only Poland, but in 1940, France, the Netherlands, etc. And before that, in Munich, they had acquired Czechoslovakia. When they acquired these countries, they got a lot of their own Jews back. Because Jews had fled to Paris, Jews had fled to Brussels, Antwerp, Prague, etc. And as Germany occupied these countries, they found their own German Jews back, the ones they wanted to get rid of, including the indigenous population. So, as time went on, they figured this is not going to work. How can we get rid of the Jews permanently? And so, a man named Heydrich, who was Himmler's right-hand man, convened a conference in a suburb of Berlin called Wannsee, and to which, by the way, which is on the river and has a very nice beach thing, and I used to go there as a boy to swim. And they, within an hour and a half, decided not only on how to get rid of the Jews of all of Europe, except for the countries which they didn't occupy, Spain, Portugal, Sweden, and how to do it. To roll the Jewish population of Europe from the west to the east, and to establish ghettos. Well, ghettos they had already established, but anyway, to get them into the ghettos, because the extermination camps weren't ready yet. So they got to the Warsaw ghetto, the ghetto in Lublin, the ghettos in other places. And then the camps were ready. There were at least 5 primary extermination camps, the job of which was production of death. And including, of course, Auschwitz, which was the best known, is the best known. And Georgette mentioned my wife. My wife was deported from Transylvania, which was between Hungary and Romania. And when the Germans came into Hungary in March of '44, within 2 months, or shortly, more than 2 months, they managed to get rid of the largest body of Jewish life in Europe, Hungary. and they deported 420,000 Jews to Auschwitz within 2 months, or a little more than 2 months, under the able direction of Eichmann. And by the way, speaking of Eichmann, I worked in his office for a little while as a prisoner. His office was badly damaged in Berlin, and we were a group of about 20 prisoners who were taken there every morning by truck, and are supposed to fix things up, restore the building so it could be used again. The building had been badly damaged by air raids, of course. I still remember carrying Eichmann's desk together with 3 other guys over a badly damaged staircase downstairs. That was one of the places, by the way, from which I escaped. That was my easiest escape. They also had us build a supposedly bomb-proof shelter. And another guy and I were given buckets, each one of us got a bucket, and we were told to go to a pump, which was about a block or 2 away. Berlin still had large pumps, water pumps, from the days of the horse carriages, to water the horses. And they forgot to give us a guard. So we took the buckets, went to the pump, put it down, and kept going. Which was very easy, except it was not easy to stay out. Anyway, so my wife, her father had already been killed. She and her mother were taken to Auschwitz. And one of the things that she could never really digest was when they arrived in Auschwitz, in Birkenau, after 3 days of cattle car travel. Raus, raus, out. So about 2,000 or 3,000 Jews came out of the cattle cars onto the platform. And of course there was panic and confusion. They didn't know where the hell they were, what was going to happen to them, and that. And her mother, who was 42 at the time, saw a little girl, 10 years old or something like that, who was crying. Mommy, she had lost track of her mother in the panic. So my wife's mother took her by the hand and said, darling, don't worry, we're going to find your mommy. Just stay with me. And of course they were immediately divided into 2 columns, one men and the other one women and children. So my wife's mother ended up in the column women and children. And the initial selection was made by a man whose name you probably have heard, Dr. Mengele, and any child that looked like it might be under 15 years old. Of course he didn't ask for papers. And his mother were immediately sent that way to the gas. And so my wife's mother died. She might have otherwise, probably she would have gotten into the camp, which doesn't mean that she would have survived it. But anyway, she would have gotten into the camp if it hadn't been for that little girl whom she had taken by the hand and so on. So Mengele assumed as a woman and a child, so out to the gas she goes. So back to the Wannsee Conference, where they decided how to make the final solution. And the only solution that can be done is to kill all the Jews of Europe, except those countries where they were not present. Spain, Portugal, Sweden, and 1 or 2 others. And that's what they did. So there was a girl I loved very much. Her name is, I think mentioned there, Ilse Rosenthal. I was not a deportation case. The deportations in Berlin started in 42. I was not a deportation case because my parents had been divorced and I lived in the same household with my Aryan mother. I was subject to all the rules pertaining to Jews because even though I was only, quote, 50% Jewish, I had elected to be a bar mitzvah in September of 35, when I was 13. Coincidentally, the same week when the Nuremberg laws were promulgated, which defined who was a Jew and who isn't. So I became a Jew in September of 35. One of my main motives was to get a bicycle. and I got a bicycle, which was stolen 3 weeks later. I became a Jew for nothing. It's funny, but it's true. So anyway, I was very much in love with this girl, and as the vacations began, my friends and I believed that this was a one-way ticket to Poland. 99% of the German Jews thought we were crazy. I mean, we didn't talk about them, but the general consensus was, this is crazy. We're going to be deported, we're going to be beaten, starved, worked to death, etc. But killing all of us, like a factory, that's crazy. This is the middle of the 20th century. This is one of the most civilized countries in the world. A couple of my friends and I believed they mean what they say. They want to knock up their finished. So I told my girl, when your time comes, you mustn't go. And her mother thought I was crazy, and her mother correctly thought that I just wanted to keep her for myself, which I did. She was, when we fell in love, she was 16, I was 18. She was 18 and I was 20. And so when the time came, she did go she went underground. She became illegal. And in order to help her and to save her for myself, egotistically, I became illegal with her. So I left home. I never was a star in the first place, and didn't go to forced labor anymore. I had been assigned to forced labor. So I became illegal too. In Germany, being illegal was not easy. The Germans are very thorough about papers. We had no papers. You couldn't stay any place for one night without being registered with the police precinct. Of course, we couldn't do that. So we had a very, very tough time to find a place to get off the street and to sleep. My own first cousins wouldn't let us in. We managed for 3 months. It was very tough. We did all kinds of things. And I was more of a danger to her than she to me, because I was 20 years old. I was not in uniform. Everybody else was in uniform. It was the middle of World War II. And, you know, what's this guy doing here? He has 2 arms and 2 legs. He's not crippled. Why isn't he in uniform? So we were caught. And that was one of the worst days of my life, obviously, when I lost my girl. And she went almost straight to Auschwitz. I knew I would never see her again. And I was in a dungeon, which is indescribable, in the cellar of the police headquarters in Berlin. There were 3 cells. Each cell was about half the size of this room, with 200 prisoners in it. I think I was the only Jew. These were people from Poland, from Russia, from Ukraine, from anywhere in Europe, French, Italian, who had committed some kind of crime or some kind of infraction of the rules, like not going to forced labor or whatever, and they were thrown in there. It was terrible. There was no room to even sit on the floor. There was one toilet for 200 people, which overflowed, of course, all the time. Every morning, the steel doors were opened, and a great bucket of soup was put in. The soup was hot water with some potato peels swimming in it. We were given about 10, 12, 15 bowls for 200 people. So they started taking the so-called soup and burned their tongues, and then a little while later, bless you, a little while later, the soup was cold. Of course, the water was cold, so all they got was cold water. And also, every morning they called out names. Sometimes as few as 20, and sometimes as many as 50. So. And they were taken out. And 10 minutes later, we heard machine gun fire up above. We were below the ground. This was above. So we assumed that all or most of them were being mowed down. I didn't know, do I want my name to be called or not to be called? If it's not called, I'm going to get stuck here, howl, and the lights were raining from the ceiling. But if I'm called, then maybe I won't live another more than 10 minutes. I wasn't really going to talk about this, but anyway, if you bear with me. One day after I'd been in this place for about 3 or 4 weeks, my name was called together with some others. We were taken out, and first we were deloused. Not out of consideration for us, but out of consideration for the guards in the place wherever we were going to be taken. We didn't know where. So our clothes were taken away, they were fumigated or something, and we were given hot showers. And then we were taken to the courtyard, and there was a truck with a trailer. Open truck and trailer, but covered with canvas. And I already had made up my mind, I'm not going to stick around. So I made sure that I got into the trailer. I got into the trailer, and there were about 20, 25, 30 other prisoners in the trailer. And the canvas was buttoned at the end. And next to this button area sat an SS man with a drawn pistol. And I noticed that one of the buttons was not buttoned. Why, I don't know. I made up my mind, I'm going to do it. So I sort of gently wormed my way to the very end of the trailer and took a deep breath and tore the thing open and jumped out head first. And the truck was going about 30, 35 miles an hour. We had no idea where it was going. I did a somersault on the street. The only thing I noticed was a woman screaming. She probably thought I had been run over by a truck. And I jumped up and ran in the opposite direction, of course. I didn't do as much damage as breaking a fingernail. I didn't break a fingernail. A few years ago, I slipped on a street near Madison Avenue and broke my hip. So, it goes to show you with age. So anyway, and I ran. And it was a beautiful day. It was May 1st, 1943. I remember beautiful blue skies and that. And I remembered that I knew a guy who was a communist, not a Jew, of course, a German communist, but nobody knew about it. I happened to know about it, that he was a communist. But he didn't do anything about it. What could he have done? So anyway, I went to him. He took me in. He got rid of my clothes and gave me some old clothes of his own. He went to the drugstore and got some anti-lice salve or something. Gave me a hot bath. Days later, everybody in the apartment still had lice. And I got typhus. Spotted fever. So they let me be in their bed. He had a girlfriend. And for 2-3 days, my fever went into the stratosphere. I was not really conscious. I didn't know who I was and where I was. And I sweated terribly. I was swimming in my own sweat. And they assumed that I would die. And he already had made a plan how to get rid of my body. He was going to put me into an empty potato sack, put me onto a pushcart, and at night dump me in the river. But it didn't come to that. I recovered. And then began my odyssey of court, escape. I escaped 3 times. I was caught 4 times. As I said, the second escape was the easiest, just walking away from that pump. But I couldn't stay out. Couldn't find a place to hide and all that. I want to talk about one other thing briefly. When Hitler came to power, I was 10 years old. In 1945, I was 22. I'd really known nothing but Nazi Europe, not just Nazi Germany, Nazi Europe. because almost all of Europe was in Nazi hands, German hands. I became the favorite of our commandant. Our little prison, the deportations from Berlin had already long been accomplished, so there were only a few Jews left in Berlin. Some illegals like myself who were caught, and Jews who were not deportation cases, mostly Jews who lived in mixed marriages. I did 3 jobs in that little prison. One, every air raid, I had to go up onto the attic and get rid of the fire bombs. The British dropped not only explosive bombs, but they also dropped cute little fire bombs about that long, half of which was phosphorus, the other one half was nothing. And when they fell through the roof, the friction ignited the phosphorus. And if you didn't take care of it, the building would burn down. And there was a bucket of sand, and I had to grab it by the nothing end and stick it into the sand. That was one of my jobs. Another job was I learned how to be a glazier, somebody who puts glass into windows. And people's windows fell out all the time, including the Gestapo's. And I learned how to do the fixed glass into windows. Except after a while they ran out of glass and I had to put it together out of pieces of glass. I found out later from a journalist that I was on the receiving end of 363 air raids. You get used to it. Mostly British until the last 2 years of the war. The British came only at night. The Americans came only during the day. And it was always a very pleasant experience to see the British I couldn't see, but the Americans, these birds in the sky in perfect formation, and then suddenly like confetti, little silvery things would come down. These were the bombs. But if they were right above you, you were perfectly safe because the planes are going at 300 and 350 miles an hour, and there was the impetus for the bombs to, not fall straight, but at an angle. But we were bombed a couple of times, directly. Another job that I had was to save people in buildings which had collapsed. Of course, under the watchful eyes of the SS. A building in the immediate neighborhood of the prison. An apartment building was bombed, deteriorated, fell down, collapsed, and there were sometimes, and most of the time, there were people buried under the ruins of the building. My job was to crawl under the ruins and to pull them out. Some were dead, some were alive. It was not a pleasant job, but I've said to myself, it's better than Auschwitz. So I did that. Then I got sick, and I was taken to a sort of cell for sick people, for sick prisoners. Again, I remind you, I was not a deportation case. I never became a deportation case. But I was a criminal. I had not won the star, I had not gone to forced labor, and I was caught together with a Jewess. So I got the flu. And I was in a little cell, and they brought in a man. It was difficult to notice that it was a human being. His face was black from blood that had coalesced or whatever you call it. And he was obviously in very bad shape. And he was very brave. He just moaned slightly. And after a day or two, his color became more green than black. And another day or two, it became yellow. So it looked like he was going to be all right. After 5 or 6 days, he died. What had he done? I found out. He had stood in front of a church in Berlin, which had been bombed that night, and was was burning down. And there were, of course, a bunch of people around. And he said something like, now you know what it feels like to have your synagogues or churches burned, which was a very stupid thing to say. So they beat him and kicked him, and they must have hit some internal organs because the blood wasn't flowing. The problem was at the back. So that, that kind of stuff happened not very infrequently. You just had to be careful what you did and what you said. And then came January 45. And in January 45, 3 girls came from Auschwitz. Nobody had ever heard of anybody coming from Auschwitz. These 3 girls came originally from Transylvania, from Hungary. And they had been close to Auschwitz, and they survived Auschwitz. And Auschwitz was closed in early January of 45, not for the holidays, but because the Red Army was at the gate. And they took 1,000 girls on a death march, which ended up in Bergen-Belsen, but they didn't know it, they didn't tell them where they were going. And she and 2 other girls escaped from that march. But we were caught a day or 2 later in a little town in Germany, somewhere in the middle of Germany. And they told the Gestapo there that they were half Jewish. They had to explain why their hair was only about half an inch long. And they were some cock and bull stories. And they didn't quite know what to do with them. So they figured, let's send them to Berlin, let them know about it. So they sent them to Berlin, and that's when they arrived in the place where I was in January of 45. It was a miracle. Even our commandant came down to the office to look at them. We'd never seen anybody coming from Auschwitz. My father, by the way, had been deported to Theresienstadt and died there. I figured I would never see anything. So, now it became, well, we knew that Germany was losing the war. We had no access to newspapers or radio or whatever. We knew it. How, I don't know, we knew it. We knew that the Red Army was coming more and closer and closer and closer. And now it became late March or early April. And we knew that the Red Army was stopped at the Oder River, which is about 100 kilometers east of Berlin. And they stayed for a month. We said to ourselves, what's the matter with these damn Russians? Why don't they move? What are they doing? Playing golf there or having a good time? Whatever. For a month they stayed at the Oder River. And then they came. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers. 70,000 pieces of artillery, which was a main weapon for the Russians. 50,000 tanks. And the Germans had mobilized old and young, everybody they could grab, about 1 million people as defenders. They didn't have a prayer. So the Russians surrounded Berlin and squeezed it to death. Then we found out what this was all about. There were two Soviet army groups. One was the first Belarusian, White Russian army group under the command of Marshal Zhukov, and the other one was the first Ukrainian army group under the command of Ivan Konev, totaling 2.5 million men. They had a problem. They had to get across the Oder River, which was swollen, it was spring by melting snow or whatever. So, and the Germans were at the other edge of the river, and of course were defending it as much as they could. So they had to bring out pontoons, they had to bring out all kinds of stuff that would float, and the marshals had to go back to Moscow to get their latest orders from Uncle Stalin, and so on. And finally, they broke down. They broke out. They got across the river. Great casualties, but they got across, and they got to Berlin in 3 waves. One was the fighting army, the fighting troops, the battle troops. The second group was the support groups, the field kitchens, the ones who got the ammunition to the front, and so on. And the third group was administrative stuff. I don't really know what the hell they were doing. And we were in our prison. We were in the cellar. And one morning we woke up, we knew it's the end. The question is, are they going to shoot us or not? And one morning we woke up and the door to the cellar was open, there was no guard. They had disappeared. It turned out later that they had checked their uniforms and became butcher, baker, candlestick maker, whatever. And our commandant was caught subsequently and died in a prison camp about a year later. So now start the battle. And I still remember one incident. I hope I don't waste too much of your time. Again, I had been under the Nazi regime for 12 years. I had seen the Allies, but they were up in the sky. I couldn't reach them. They couldn't reach me. I couldn't reach them. All they could do is drop bombs on my head. But that's all. But now the Russians were coming on the ground. And one afternoon was again a beautiful day, blue sky, must have been April. And I had pretty much around the prison. I heard thunder. I figured, well, there must be a thunderstorm somewhere. And it was blue sky. The thunder didn't stop. It even got gradually a little louder. And suddenly, and I will never forget, maybe another term, which is not like it. This ain't thunder. This is Soviet artillery. You cannot imagine what that meant to me. So that's what it was. And then a day or two later came the first troops. Just a bunch of a dozen boys, 18, 19 years old, with red cheeks, having a wonderful time, schlepping a howitzer, which is a small caliber cannon, like a baby carriage with them, made nothing of it. Set it up in the valley, in the gate of our prison, and across the street were some German machine gun nests. So they started to fire directly, not in a bow, in a whatever you call it, but directly into the machine gun nest. And two guys and I, we got out of the cellar, and the ammunition they had for the howitzer was about, I don't know, 12 feet away. So we wanted to help, so we reached the ammunition to them. They looked at us, they didn't know we were Jews, besides they didn't even know what the hell Jews are. And were wondering here, these German civilians are helping? Okay. So that was it. And we noticed they fired that thing by pulling on a string. Now we got more chutzpah. So more in sign language than anything else, because I didn't speak Russian. Let us put it. Be my guest. So I pulled that string once or twice. With a big bang. I don't know whether I hit anything, but I got my licks in. So, and then, of course, the battle, that was tremendous. And for days we had no water, we had no food, we had nothing. So anyway, but we were free. And a mile or two away from us, Hitler committed suicide. We didn't know. We didn't care. Anyway, so that was the battle was over. And meanwhile, Olga and I had fallen in love. We didn't speak the same language. She spoke Hungarian, and who speaks Hungarian who doesn't have to do? I spoke German. So we spoke school French with one another. But if you're in love, anything will do. So, and we were liberated. And ours was probably the first Jewish wedding in Berlin after the war. First in the town hall, the same place where Kennedy, many years later, stood on a balcony to comfort the West Berliners by saying, "Ich bin ein Berliner," I'm a Berliner, to identify with. We were married there, and the next day we were married in one of the two little synagogues that were still standing. They had not burned it down because it was part of an apartment house block. They didn't want to take a chance in November of '38 of burning down the whole block. So that synagogue had stayed. It was badly damaged by bombs and artillery, but it was sort of hanging together, so we managed to be married there. And first time I came back to Berlin about 2 or 3 years ago, of course I went to the synagogue, which was restored now and guarded by police. And they had services there Friday night, and it was a little tough for me to be there 60 years after my wife and I had gone up to the Bima to be married. And but anyway, so that's about my story. That's it, I guess. Sit.
If anyone has a question.
I want to tell you one more story. I wanted to be an actor. You can tell I'm a hack. I wanted to be an actor. Now, of course, during the war, and now I figured I might as well try to do something in the profession which I would like to have. But there were no theaters. They were all bombed. They were all smashed. But there was a